Hello and welcome to today's lesson. In previous lessons we've looked at homeostasis principles and thermal regulation in mammals. Today we're going to be looking at thermal regulation in ectotherms. By the end of this lesson you should be able to explain the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. You should be able to explain how environmental temperature affects body temperature and oxygen consumption in endotherms and ectotherms, and you should be able to compare and contrast the methods used by endotherms and ectotherms for thermal regulation. So as you would do for any other lesson, can you make sure you write the title please, Thermal Regulation in Ectotherms, and we will make a start. Now I want to start today's lesson with looking at quite a few keywords and key definitions, and remember in my lessons key terms are always written in green. Okay, the first key term we need to think about is the term endotherm. Endotherm, okay, E-N-D-O-T-H-E-R-M. Now an endotherm can be defined as an organism that which maintains a constant temperature via or by a high metabolic rate. So an endotherm is an organism which maintains a constant temperature by a high metabolic rate. Now what we mean by a metabolic rate is the chemical reactions that take place within the organism. Okay, so the metabolic rate is the chemical reactions inside all cells of the organism. Okay? Now essentially what this is saying is that the cells of the organism carry out respiration. This creates thermal energy as a waste product which is used to keep the organism warm, and it allows it to maintain its body temperature. So we can say underneath here in red, essentially with endotherms, that the heat or thermal energy produced by respiration or by cellular respiration is used to maintain body temperature. Okay? So essentially, the organism has mechanisms in place that if it gets too hot, it cools down, but if it gets too cold, it uses metabolic reactions or respiration inside of cells to generate heat, which warms it back up. Now, these are the organisms we spoke about last lesson, and examples of endotherms include, so e.g., birds and mammals. Okay, so these are essentially the organisms we spoke about last lesson. Now, endotherms are usually homeotherms. We can class endotherms as a homeotherm. Okay, so these are usually homeotherms, which is Homeotherm. Now, a homeotherm can be defined, if I can spell homeotherm. A homeotherm can be defined as an organism that maintains thermal homeostasis. Okay? Now, we are examples of homeotherms because we need to maintain our body temperature at about 37 degrees Celsius. So we can put underneath here, e.g., humans keep internal body temperature to about 37 degrees Celsius. Now, no matter what the temperature is in the environment, if it's very, very cold, so as I record this, it's been snowing all day, it's very cold outside. If I was to go outside, my external environment would be very, very cold. My phone is currently saying that it's about -2. If I was to go outside in -2 conditions, my body, my hypothalamus would put processes in place to ensure that my body remains at 37 degrees Celsius. In the summer, if I go out and outside it's 42 degrees Celsius, my hypothalamus will put things in place that mean my body temperature stays at 37 degrees Celsius. Now, if I'm too cold, if I go outside in the aforementioned snow and my body temperature starts to drop, cellular respiration will start to increase my body temperature, and therefore I am a homeotherm and an endotherm. I am both. So we can say that in we'll say despite the environmental temperature a human's body temperature will remain around 37 degrees Celsius due to homeostatic mechanisms. Now, we spoke about that last lesson. We spoke about how negative feedback can cause our body temperature to rise and drop. We can also add that if human body temperature starts to drop, respiration in cells can be used to raise it. Full stop. So for this reason, humans are endothermic homeotherms. So for this reason, comma, humans are endotherms and homeotherms. Okay? So an endotherm is an organism which maintains a constant temperature by a high metabolic rate. Metabolic rate is the chemical reactions that take place in the cells of an organism. And thermal energy is produced by cellular respiration, which is used to maintain body temperature. Examples of endotherms include birds and mammals, and endotherms are usually homeotherms. So a homeotherm is an organism that maintains thermal homeostasis. For example, humans keep their body temperature at about 37 degrees Celsius using negative feedback. Despite the environmental temperature, a human's body temperature will remain around 37 degrees Celsius due to homeostatic mechanisms. If human body temperature starts to drop, respiration in cells can be used to raise it. For that reason, humans are classed as endotherms and homeotherms. Now, this is slightly different to what we call ectotherms. And let's break that down a bit. So an ectotherm is spelled E-C-T-O-T-H-E-R-M. An ectotherm is defined as an organism that maintains its body temperature via external sources. Via external sources. Okay? Now, essentially, what we're saying here is that ectotherms require the environment to regulate their body temperature. They have no homeostatic mechanism to do this. So I'm going to put underneath here in red first that they do not have homeostatic / physiological mechanisms to regulate body temperature. Okay? So they don't have homeostatic mechanisms or physiological mechanisms for that matter to regulate their body temperature. Essentially, they rely on the environment to do this. So they rely on the environment being warm if they want to heat up, and they rely on the environment being cold if they want to cool down. So we can put underneath here again, in fact I'm not going to use that, I'm going to use blue. We can say that they rely on the environment to regulate body temperature. Okay? Now, examples of ectotherms include reptiles. So, an example of an ectotherm, e.g., is a reptile. Okay? Most ectotherms are what are known as poikilotherms. It's a big word, I know. So, most are poikilotherms. 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 And we're going to define that anyway, so if you can't read that, don't worry. So, poikilotherms. Okay? Now, a poikilotherm is an organism who allows their body temperature to fluctuate widely. Okay? These are the opposite to mammals and humans. We keep ours at 37 degrees Celsius. However, a poikilotherm allows their body temperature to fluctuate. Okay? So a poikilotherm is an organism whose internal body temperature will fluctuate widely. Okay? So an organism whose internal body temperature will fluctuate widely. Now, if you think about it, if you're a lizard and you are in a very cold environment, so if I got a lizard now, if I was being really cruel and I took it out into the snow, which I mentioned earlier, and I put a bearded dragon, because it's much smaller than a Komodo dragon, if I put a bearded dragon out in the snow, its body temperature would drop because it has absolutely no homeostatic mechanism by which it can raise its body temperature. Its body temperature will keep dropping until it matches that of the environment. It would drop to probably -2 and the bearded dragon would die. At the same time, if I took a bearded dragon and I put it in the middle of the Sahara Desert, its body temperature would raise up to whatever the temperature is in the Sahara Desert. Okay? So we can say that while humans maintain body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius, reptiles have no way of doing this. Have no way of doing this. Full stop. The body temperature of a reptile will match that of the environment it is in. Okay? So if you are a poikilotherm, your body temperature will match that of the environment. So we can say that this can vary widely. Full stop. Reptiles are ectotherms and poikilotherms. So an ectotherm is an organism that maintains its body temperature via external sources, so it can't do it itself, it can't do it via homeostasis, therefore it relies on the environment to regulate its body temperature. Examples of ectotherms are reptiles. Most ectotherms are also poikilotherms. Poikilotherms are organisms that allow their body temperature to fluctuate widely, so it won't stay around a set value. It's the opposite of homeostasis. While humans maintain a body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius, reptiles have no way of doing this. The body temperature of a reptile will match that of the environment it's in. This can vary widely. For that reason, we say reptiles are ectotherms and poikilotherms. So, the question is, how do reptiles actually maintain their body temperature? And that's going to be the subject of this next part. So, how do ectotherms regulate body temperature? Now, just like any other organisms, ectotherms also have a metabolism which is regulated by enzymes. Therefore, they cannot just let their body temperature go really, really hot or really, really cold, because the enzymes that control these reactions will no longer work. So it's important to keep in mind, and I'm going to put it in red, that ectotherms still have a metabolism which consists of many enzyme-controlled reactions. So for this reason, we can't, an ectotherm can't let itself freeze. You won't find an organism that freezes in a block of ice and then when the ice melts, it's fine, it just comes back to life and does whatever it does. If an organism was to do that, its enzymes would lose so much kinetic energy that the reactions that they control would stop, and therefore the organism would die. At the same time, there's no such thing as an organism that you can put in the oven, heat it up really, really hot, and then bring it out, and once it cools down a bit, it'll be fine. It doesn't work like that. The enzymes would still denature. So ectotherms still have to keep their body temperature within set limits so that enzymes do not denature. So ectotherms still need to keep body temperature within set limits so that enzymes work. So they are still kept within this law that you find that endotherms are kept within, okay? So how do ectotherms actually regulate their body temperature? There's lots of different things that they do. So for example, ectotherms, we'll often find reptiles basking in the sun to heat up. So you find that a lot of ectotherms, I hope I forgot to spell ectotherms, ectotherms bask in the sun. So bask in the sun. Essentially what we mean by this is that they sunbathe. Okay? You find that lizards stand on a rock and hold their face up to the sun in order to warm up. Okay? So we can say underneath here that reptiles sit in the sun or sit in the sunlight to warm up. At the same time, if they want to cool down, they go into the shade. So ectotherms seek out shade. Okay, so they seek out shade, and this allows them to cool down. Now, you'll find that a lot of organisms will move between land and water, such as, for example, crocodiles. Crocodiles shuttle between the land and the water, so if they get too hot, they go in the water. If they get too cold, they go on the land and sunbathe. So many ectotherms will switch between water and land to regulate their body temperature. So we can put that many ectotherms, and a good example is crocodiles, e.g. crocodiles switch between land and water to regulate body temperature. So a crocodile, when it's too cold, will stand on the land and bask in the sun, up until a point it starts to get too hot, where it will walk into the water and cool down. And then when it gets too cold, it will walk out the water and stand on the land to warm up. And once it gets too warm, it will go back in the water and cool down. Okay? It's using its environment to regulate its body temperature. Now, the benefit of this is that ectotherms use 1/10 of the energy that endotherms do. Because endotherms have to maintain this constant body temperature, their cells have to constantly go through respiration. Therefore, they need lots of energy to do this. However, ectotherms don't need as much energy. Reptiles use 1/10 of what humans do. So I'm going to put in red that endotherms need cells to be carrying out constant respiration to maintain body temperature. Okay? So your cells, as you sit here, are trying to keep your body at 37 degrees Celsius. Your hypothalamus, apologies, is trying to keep your body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. Therefore, it needs your cells constantly doing respiration to keep your body temperature above that of what the environment is. Ectotherms do not need to do this, and therefore only use 1/10 of the energy of endotherms. So ectotherms do not need to do this, and only use 1/10 of the energy of endotherms. Now this is really useful. If you're an endotherm, if you're anything like me, you're constantly eating. Okay, I like to graze. I like to eat all of the time. And that is so I can provide my cells with lots of glucose so that they can carry out respiration, so that they can keep my body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. Crocodiles are an ectotherm, and they don't need to eat as much. They only require 1/10 of the energy that we do, because they don't need to maintain this body temperature. So this means that they can eat less. Okay, they don't need to eat as much as we do. So we can say that ectotherms can go longer periods without eating as a result, because they require much less energy. Now, muscular activity inside reptiles comes mostly from anaerobic respiration. This means that glycogen is immediately available. They're immediately able to get glycogen to their muscles for short bursts of activity. However, if they do activity between 3 to 5 minutes, so much lactate is built that they need hours in order to recoup from it. So we can say that, I'm trying to think what colour I haven't used, we'll go to this one, that ectotherms rely mostly on anaerobic respiration for muscle activity so glycogen stores are readily available. Okay, so these glycogen stores are readily available so that the ectotherm, or reptiles in particular, can do these short bursts of activity. However, the problem is that this takes much longer to recoup from, and it only allows short bursts of activity. So this only allows short bursts of activity and takes a long time to recover from. Okay, so ectotherms still have a metabolism which consists of enzyme control reactions, and therefore they need to keep their body temperature within a set range so that the enzymes work as they need them to. Ectotherms can bask in the sun in order to heat up, and they can go in the shade or in water in order to cool down. So they rely on lots of behavioral adaptations to allow them to regulate their body temperature. Many ectotherms, such as crocodiles, will switch between the land and water to regulate their body temperature. While endotherms need their cells to carry out respiration constantly in order to maintain your body temperature, as you sit here now, your external environment is probably about 25 degrees. You need it to be at 37, so the cells in your body are constantly doing respiration to warm you up. Ectotherms don't need to do that. They only use 1/10 of the energy of endotherms. Therefore, ectotherms can go longer periods without eating as a result. Off the top of my head, I'm not going to Google it now, you may wish to. Off the top of my head, crocodiles can go a ridiculous amount of time without eating purely because they don't use much energy. They have such a slow metabolism. Ectotherms rely mostly on anaerobic respiration for muscle activity, so glycogen stores are readily available. However, this only allows short bursts of activity of about 3 to 5 minutes, and they can take days to recover from. So, let's compare, oh, I don't want to do that. Let's compare endotherms and ectotherms. Okay? On one side, we're going to have the ectotherms, and on the other side, the endotherms. So on this side, we're going to have our ectotherms, and on this side, we're going to have our endotherms. And we're going to compare them, okay? So ectotherms can't control body temperature by physiological means, so rely on their behavior, so they rely on moving from hot to cold areas, whereas endotherms control their body temperature by physiological means and behavioral. By physiological means and behavioral. Remember, you are a human, so you are an endotherm. If you get too hot, you might take your jumper off. If you get too cold, you may go and sit in the sun. You may put a heater on. These are all examples of behavioral actions which allow you to regulate your body temperature. Now, in ectotherms, the internal body temperature relies on the environment. So it relies on the external temperature. Whereas in endotherms, your internal temperature is affected less by the external. So internal temperature is independent to the external temperature. But I am going to put there mostly, because, and it'd help if I could spell temperature, I'm going to put mostly because obviously it is affected to some degree. If I leave you outside, you will get very cold if it's very icy outside. So I'm just going to put there in brackets mostly. In ectotherms, their activity level depends on the external temperature. So activity depends on the external temperature. Apologies about my handwriting. Depends on the external temperature. And what we mean by that is that when it's hot, an ectotherm will move much quicker. When it's cold, they will move much slower. So we can say next to this, I'm going to put it in white, more active in higher temperatures, okay? The converse also counts, so I am also going to put there actually vice versa. And what I mean by that is when it's cold, they are less active. Whereas endotherms have their activity independent of external temperature. No matter what the temperature is in the environment, you are still active. A lot of you might whinge and go, oh, I'm not going outside, it's too cold. However, if you had to run for your life, you could run through the snow, okay? So we can say that activity is independent of the external environment. As I said, it's snowing today. I still went out this morning and threw some weights about in my garden because I'm an absolute savage. So even though it is cold, I still went out and carried out my usual activities. Do you notice that I'm trying to brag here? Yeah, it didn't stop me. Whereas if I was an ectotherm, I wouldn't be able to do that. My cells wouldn't have enough the enzymes inside my cells wouldn't have enough kinetic energy in order to carry out the reactions needed. The final one, ectotherms have variable metabolic rate. and produce very little heat. For example, they're not warm-blooded animals, are they? Things like reptiles are not warm-blooded, and therefore they are ectotherms. Now, these endotherms have a constantly high metabolic rate, and generate lots of heat as a result. Now, a good way to think of this, a good sort of analogy, is to imagine that endotherms have a fire inside of them. This fire you need to provide with lots of fuel. You need to put lots of wood on a fire to keep it going. So if we have this fire inside of us, we need to keep providing fuel to that fire to keep it burning, and that's why we need to eat more. Whereas ectotherms do not have a fire inside of them. This is obviously an analogy. The organisms don't actually have a fire inside of them, but it's a good way to think of it. Ectotherms don't have this fire inside of them, and therefore they don't need to provide it with fuel. Therefore, they can eat less food over longer periods, whereas we need to keep eating. So comparing ectotherms and endotherms, ectotherms can't control their body temperature via physiological means, whereas endotherms can. Ectotherms allow their internal body temperature to rely on the external temperature of the environment, whereas the internal temperature of an endotherm is independent to that of the external environment to a certain degree. Activity of ectotherms depends on the external temperature. If it's hotter, the organism is more active, and if it's colder, it's less active, whereas endotherms are independent, have their activity independent of that in the environment around them. Ectotherms have variable metabolic rates and produce very little heat, whereas endotherms have a constantly high metabolic rate and generate lots of heat as a result. However, they do need to fuel this metabolism. But remember, this allows us to be active regardless of the environment, whereas lizards and other ectotherms can't be active if it's cold. That's why you don't see crocodiles and reptiles in the North Pole, whereas you do see polar bears, which are a mammal. Okay? So there is a payoff. There are benefits and pitfalls to each one. Final thing we need to do today is we need to discuss the graphs that are found on the PowerPoint. And I'm going to copy them and I'm going to paste them. But first of all, I'm going to click the pen, otherwise we'll get this weird thing happen. So one graph shows how as environmental temperature increases, the body temperature of organisms change. So as environmental temperature increases, the body temperature of an ectotherm increases. However, an endotherm has a body temperature that remains constant regardless of the temperature. So if we're talking about oxygen consumption and environmental temperature, the graph looks slightly different. So we can say, first of all, that endotherms maintain a constant body temperature independent of the environment. But ectotherms body temperature will increase as the environment temperature increases. Now the second graph shows how oxygen consumption is affected by environmental temperature. Now you can see that as environmental temperature increases, an endotherm's oxygen consumption decreases. Remember, endotherms require respiration to keep a high body temperature. Therefore, when it's cold, they are using lots of oxygen in order to do lots of respiration to keep their body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. And when it's warmer, their cells don't need to do as much respiration because the environment keeps their body temperature about there. Okay? So we can say that when environmental temperature is low, oxygen consumption in endotherms is high due to increased respiration to generate heat. So when it's cold in the environment, your cells do more respiration to generate more heat to keep your body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. But when it's warmer, there's no need for that. But when the environment is warmer, respiration reduces. Okay? So in endotherms, if it is cold, your cells do lots of respiration to generate lots of heat to keep your body temperature at 37 degrees Celsius. But when it is warm, they don't need to do as much respiration, and therefore they don't need to generate as much heat because it's warmer. So they don't do as much respiration. Ectotherms, on the other hand, is linked to activity. So when it's cold, ectotherms don't do much activity. Okay? So they don't need to do much respiration. However, as it goes warmer, their body start to carry out more activity and therefore need more respiration to carry out this activity. So we can say that when it is cold, ectotherms carry out little activity, so respiration is not needed, or it's needed less. Respiration is needed less. Okay? But when it's warmer, the organism carries out more respiration as it's doing more activity, and therefore there is a greater need for oxygen. So when it is warmer, ectotherms carry out more respiration, as they do more activity. Now, the reason I bring up these two graphs is because they are very common in A-level exams. This one is usually answered very, very well. This one, not so much. So, essentially, what you need to know, I'm going to put it in red, is with endotherms, they are doing more respiration, and down here, they are doing less respiration. On the ectotherm, it's the opposite. When they are cold, they do less respiration. But when they are warm, they do more respiration. You need to keep in mind that respiration carries out different functions in endotherms and ectotherms. They both release energy from glucose. All organisms have to carry out respiration. But in endotherms, they also play the role of releasing heat for the homeostasis of body temperature. But in ectotherms, the heat is simply gotten rid of. They don't need the heat. They use the heat from the environment. So they simply use the respiration to release energy from glucose. So, you should now be able to explain the difference between an endotherm and an ectotherm. You should be able to tell me how environmental temperature affects body temperature and oxygen consumption is endotherms and ectotherms. And you should be able to compare and contrast endotherms and ectotherms. If you have any questions about today's lesson, please do not hesitate to get in contact with me by the usual means. And please take care until the next video. Thank you very much.